Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's most terrifying medical professionals, a figure who emerged from humanity's darkest hour wearing a nightmare for a face. The plague doctor, that beaked specter who walked through cities of the dead, poking corpses with sticks and breathing through herbs while civilization collapsed around them. These weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were desperate men wearing leather birds' faces, trying to cure a disease they didn't understand with methods that killed patients faster than the plague itself. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of storytelling truly resonates with you. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always heartwarming to see how these quiet stories reach people from every corner of the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's 1347. You're living in a bustling Italian port city, maybe Genoa, maybe Venice. Life is good. Trade is flowing. The markets are full of exotic spices and silks from the east. Children play in the narrow streets while merchants haggle over prices and sailors tell tales of distant lands. Then one morning, you wake up to find your neighbor slumped against his doorway, black boils the size of eggs bulging from his neck. His fingers have turned black, blood trickles from his mouth mixed with a foam that smells like rotting meat. He's been dead for hours, but no one noticed because half the street is already dying. Within 3 days, those same black swellings appear on your wife's neck, then your children. Then you feel a tender spot under your own armpit, and you know. You're next. The Black Death has arrived, and it doesn't knock politely. It kicks down the door and drags entire families into the grave, sometimes within 48 hours of the first symptom. This wasn't just a disease. It was the apocalypse wearing bacterial clothing. And into this nightmare stepped a new kind of medical professional. Not quite doctor, not quite priest, not quite human in appearance. The plague doctor. But here's the thing nobody tells you about plague doctors. They weren't some ancient medieval tradition. The iconic beaked costume didn't even appear until the 17th century, 300 years after the Black Death's first devastating wave. The first plague doctors were just regular physicians, barber surgeons, or sometimes complete frauds who figured that in a city where everyone was dying, nobody would check their credentials too carefully. They wore regular clothes, maybe threw a cloth over their face if they were feeling cautious, and charged astronomical fees to poke at buboes with dirty instruments while muttering in Latin. The plague itself was democracy in its purest, most terrifying form. It didn't care if you were a prince or a pauper, a bishop or a brothel keeper. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, though nobody knew its name then, traveled in the guts of fleas that lived on rats that lived in the walls of every home from London to Constantinople. When those fleas bit humans, they injected death itself into the bloodstream. Within days, sometimes hours, lymph nodes would swell into those characteristic black buboes that gave the Black Death its name. Fever would spike, delirium would set in, blood would leak from every orifice, and then, more often than not, you died. The mortality rate was somewhere between 30 and 60%. Though in some towns it reached 90%, imagine that. 9 out of every 10 people you knew dead within a month. Entire villages simply ceased to exist. Fields went unharvested. Animals wandered masterless through empty streets. Priests refused to give last rites because getting close to the dying meant becoming one of them. And in this world of unimaginable horror, someone had to tend to the sick. Someone had to record the deaths. Someone had to maintain some pretense that civilization hadn't completely collapsed. Enter the plague doctor, humanity's most desperate medical experiment. These early plague doctors weren't trained in universities like proper physicians. Most proper physicians had fled to the countryside at the first sign of infection, leaving cities to die without them. The doctors who remained or arrived to fill the void were often the medical profession's bottom feeders. Failed students, disgraced surgeons, charlatans who saw opportunity in chaos, but also sometimes genuinely brave individuals who believed they could make a difference, even if that difference was just ensuring the dead were counted and the dying had someone, anyone, to witness their final moments. Cities hired them on contract, paying them fixed salaries to stay and treat the infected regardless of social class. It was one of history's first examples of socialized medicine, born not from progressive ideals, but from pure desperation. Venice was among the first, hiring plague doctors as early as 1348. Other cities followed, offering increasingly generous terms to anyone willing to walk into hell wearing a physician's robe. The pay was good, sometimes extraordinary, because the job was essentially a death sentence with a pension plan you'd probably never live to collect. The treatments they offered were, to put it mildly, creative. Bloodletting was popular because medieval medicine believed that all illness came from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So naturally, if you were dying from massive lymphatic infection, the solution was to drain even more of your precious bodily fluids. They'd slice veins, apply leeches, or cup the skin to draw blood to the surface. Patients who survived the plague often died from the treatment, but at least the theoretical framework was consistent. Then there was the vinegar. Everything was vinegar. Plague doctors washed their hands in vinegar, soaked their clothes in vinegar, made patients drink vinegar, and splashed vinegar on the walls, floors, and ceilings. The logic wasn't entirely wrong. Vinegar is mildly antibacterial, and the strong smell might have masked the stench of death that permeated plague-struck cities. But drinking enough vinegar to ward off the plague would probably dissolve your esophagus first, which was considered an acceptable trade-off when the alternative was drowning in your own blood. Mercury was another favorite. Beautiful, mysterious quicksilver that danced and flowed like liquid starlight. Surely something so remarkable had healing properties. Plague doctors would rub mercury ointments on buboes, have patients breathe mercury vapors, sometimes even drink small amounts of mercury mixed with wine. The fact that mercury is hideously toxic and causes madness, tremors, and organ failure was not yet common knowledge. Though given that plague victims were already experiencing madness, tremors, and organ failure, it was hard to tell what was disease and what was treatment. Some of the more adventurous plague doctors turned to what we might charitably call experimental medicine. Strapping live chickens to buboes was popular, based on the theory that the chicken would draw out the poison. The chicken invariably died, which was taken as proof that the treatment was working. The patient also invariably died, which was attributed to not using enough chickens. Others tried precious stones, ground pearls mixed with rose water, or elaborate potions containing everything from crushed emeralds to powdered unicorn horn, which was usually just narwhal tusk, sold by enterprising merchants who knew their customers were too desperate to ask questions. But perhaps the most common treatment was also the most honest. Prayer. Massive, desperate, communal prayer. Entire cities would march in procession, whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath. Plague doctors would lead prayers over the dying, not because they thought it would cure them, but because in a world where medicine had failed completely, faith was the only thing left that hadn't been proven useless. Yet, the psychological toll on these early plague doctors was devastating. Imagine being surrounded by death every waking moment. The sounds of a plague city were unlike anything in human experience. The constant moaning of the sick, the screams of the delirious, the wailing of survivors, and underneath it all, the terrible silence from houses where entire families had died and nobody had noticed yet. The smell was worse. Rotting flesh, human waste, the sickly sweet stench of buboes bursting, and the acrid smoke from burning bodies and belongings. Every breath was a reminder that the air itself might be trying to kill you. Some plague doctors turned to drink, staying perpetually drunk to numb both the horror and the fear. Others became religious fanatics, convinced that they were God's instruments in a divine cleansing. A few went mad, continuing to treat patients even after showing symptoms themselves, working until they literally dropped dead in the street, and a very few somehow maintained their sanity and humanity, writing detailed accounts of what they saw that would become invaluable historical records of one of humanity's darkest hours. The social dynamics were equally complex. Plague doctors occupied a unique position in the urban hierarchy. They were simultaneously essential and reviled, respected and feared, powerful and powerless. They could enter any home, examine any body, and their word could condemn entire buildings to quarantine. Yet they were also pariahs, forbidden from mixing with healthy society, required to carry white sticks to warn people away, and often forced to live in isolation when not working. They were priests of a diseased religion, and their congregation was the dying. Some plague doctors became wealthy if they lived long enough to spend their earnings. Others used their position to settle scores, condemning enemies' homes as infected or demanding bribes to provide treatment. A few became folk heroes, known for treating the poor with the same care as the rich, though this was rare enough to be noteworthy when it happened. Most simply did their job with grim determination, counting the days until their contract ended or their luck ran out, whichever came first. Fast forward to 1619. The plague is ravaging Europe again, because the plague never really left. It just took vacations between massacres. This time it's hitting France particularly hard, and the city of Paris is desperate for medical help. Enter Charles Delorme, chief physician to 3 French kings and a man with some very interesting ideas about protective medical equipment. Delorme didn't invent the plague doctor costume from scratch, but he refined and popularized what would become the most terrifying medical uniform in history. Picture Delorme in his workshop, surrounded by leather, glass, and herbs, designing what he genuinely believed would be armor against disease. The centerpiece was the mask, that horrible, beautiful beak that would haunt European nightmares for centuries. But it wasn't meant to be frightening. It was meant to be functional. The beak, typically 6 to 8 inches long and curved like a bird of prey, was hollow. Inside, doctors would pack aromatic herbs, spices, dried flowers, camphor, mint, cloves, myrrh, and rose petals. Sometimes they'd add cotton soaked in vinegar, because of course they did. Everything was vinegar in plague medicine. The theory behind the beak was actually somewhat sophisticated for its time. This was the era of miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air or malodorous vapors rising from rotting organic matter. The plague was thought to travel in foul-smelling clouds of corruption that invaded the body through the nose and mouth. So Delorme reasoned that if you could filter the air through pleasant-smelling substances, you could purify it before breathing. It was basically a 17th century gas mask designed by someone who didn't understand what gas was, what masks did, or how disease actually worked. But points for creativity. The eye holes were another marvel of period engineering. Made from glass, usually red or clear crystal, they were supposed to protect the eyes from the evil vapors. Red glass was particularly popular because someone, somewhere, had decided that red glass had protective properties against plague. This was never explained, tested, or proven. It just became accepted fact, because in plague times, any explanation was better than admitting complete ignorance. The glass was held in place with leather straps that wrapped around the head, creating an airtight seal that must have been absolutely suffocating in summer. But the mask was just the beginning. The full plague doctor costume was a masterpiece of leather engineering that would make a medieval dominatrix jealous. The main garment was a long, ankle-length overcoat made from waxed leather or oiled cloth. Morocco leather was preferred, being supple and water-resistant, but most doctors made do with whatever dead cow was available. The coat was sealed at the neck, wrists, and ankles to prevent any plague-bearing air from sneaking in. Underneath, they wore leather breeches, leather gloves, and leather boots. Everything was leather. These doctors basically walked around encased in an entire herd's worth of skin. The waxing process was crucial. The leather would be treated with a mixture of tallow, wax, and various aromatic oils. This created a theoretically impermeable barrier against the miasmic vapors. It also made the doctors incredibly flammable, which became a real problem when they had to work near the fires used to purify plague houses. More than one plague doctor went up like a human candle when they got too close to an open flame, adding burning leather and screaming to the already substantial list of plague-related horrors. The hat was equally distinctive, a wide-brimmed leather hat, usually black, that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, it kept rain off the mask's eye holes and added another layer of protection against descending miasmas. Symbolically, it marked the wearer as a medical professional, though the 6-foot beak probably already communicated that fairly effectively. Some doctors added feathers or other decorations to their hats, because even in the midst of apocalyptic disease, humans can't resist a little fashion. But the most important accessory wasn't part of the costume at all. It was the stick. Every plague doctor carried a long wooden cane, usually about 4 to 6 feet long, sometimes with a small flag attached. This wasn't a walking stick or a fashion statement. It was a tool with multiple horrifying purposes. First, it allowed doctors to examine patients without touching them. They could lift bed sheets, move clothing, and point to buboes from a safe distance. Second, it was used to ward off desperate family members who might try to grab the doctor in their panic. Third, and this is the truly grim part, it was used to determine if patients were still alive by poking them to see if they responded. The psychological impact of this costume cannot be overstated. Imagine being deathly ill, possibly delirious with fever, and having this creature walk into your bedroom. A towering figure in black leather with a massive curved beak where its face should be, red glass eyes gleaming in the candlelight, approaching you with a long stick. You're not sure if it's a doctor, a demon, or death itself come to collect you. The outfit that was supposed to protect doctors and reassure patients that medical help had arrived instead became a walking nightmare that probably scared some patients to death before the plague could finish the job. Children would run screaming at the sight of a plague doctor. Adults would cross themselves and mutter prayers. Dogs would bark and cower. Even other medical professionals found the costume unsettling. One French physician wrote that plague doctors looked like giant birds of prey descended from hell to feast upon the dying. This was not the reassuring bedside presence that medical ethics typically encourages. But the doctors themselves had complicated relationships with their costumes. Some embraced the fear they inspired, using it to maintain order in chaotic plague hospitals or to ensure quarantine rules were followed. Others tried to soften their appearance with colorful scarves or friendly greetings, though it's hard to appear friendly when you look like a leather-wrapped nightmare bird. Many simply accepted that their appearance was the price of survival, though whether the costume actually protected them was highly debatable. The effectiveness of the plague doctor outfit was, to put it charitably, mixed. The leather might have provided some protection against flea bites, which were the actual transmission vector for bubonic plague, though nobody knew this at the time. The beak full of aromatics did absolutely nothing to prevent airborne disease, but it probably made the job psychologically bearable by masking the overwhelming stench of death. The stick definitely helped maintain distance from infectious patients, which was genuinely useful even if the reasoning was wrong. But the costume had serious drawbacks. The sealed leather made movement difficult, and temperature regulation impossible. Plague doctors would routinely pass out from heat exhaustion in summer, or struggle with hypothermia in winter, because the outfit trapped sweat against the skin. The limited vision from the glass eye holes meant doctors couldn't see patients properly, leading to misdiagnosis and accidents. The muffled hearing from the leather hood meant they couldn't understand what patients were saying. Not that plague victims were particularly coherent anyway. There was also the problem of taking the costume off. After a day of visiting plague houses, the outfit would be covered in God knows what. Blood, pus, vomit, and other fluids that don't bear thinking about. The doctor had to carefully remove each piece without contaminating himself, usually with the help of assistants who were themselves at risk. Many doctors simply lived in their costumes for days at a time, sleeping in the leather because taking it off and putting it back on was too dangerous and time-consuming. The social isolation was equally challenging. Plague doctors couldn't return to normal society while wearing the costume, and taking it off didn't make them any more welcome. They were permanently marked as carriers of disease, walking reminders of mortality that nobody wanted around. Many lived in separate quarters, ate alone, and had no social contact beyond their patients and other plague workers. It was a lonely, terrifying existence wrapped in leather and suspicion. Yet despite all this, the plague doctor costume persisted and spread across Europe. Every major city had its own variations. Venetian plague doctors added golden buttons and silk linings because even in plague times, Venetians had to be fashionable. German plague doctors made their beaks longer, sometimes up to a foot, because German engineering always goes for maximum efficiency. English plague doctors often skipped the waxed leather in favor of oiled canvas, which was cheaper but also less protective and made them look like walking tents. The costume evolved into something more than protective equipment. It became a symbol, a brand, a statement of professional identity. Plague doctors began to take pride in their outfits, passing them down to apprentices or having them specially made by the finest leather workers. Some added personal touches like family crests or medical symbols. Others inscribed prayers or protective charms into the leather. The costume that started as desperate improvisation became a tradition, a uniform that said, "I walk with death and come back alive." So what exactly did a plague doctor do all day besides terrifying children and poking corpses? Their job description would make modern emergency room doctors weep with sympathy and horror. These leather-clad birdmen were simultaneously physicians, coroners, census takers, quarantine enforcers, and last rites providers. They were also, quite often, the only city officials who didn't flee at the first sign of plague, making them de facto mayors of the dying. A typical day began before dawn. The plague doctor would carefully put on his protective costume, a process that could take an hour with assistance. Every strap had to be secured, every seam checked, every gap sealed. The herbs in the beak would be refreshed, crushed, and mixed with new vinegar. The eye holes would be cleaned with more vinegar because, again, vinegar was the duct tape of plague medicine. Then came the mental preparation, which usually involved prayer, alcohol, or both, sometimes simultaneously. The first task was rounds at the plague hospitals, and calling them hospitals is generous. They were more like death warehouses where the infected were stored until they either recovered or didn't. These facilities were usually repurposed monasteries, warehouses, or sometimes just large tents on the outskirts of town. The conditions were indescribable. Hundreds of patients crammed into spaces meant for dozens, lying on straw mattresses that hadn't been changed in weeks, surrounded by the dead who hadn't been removed yet, because everyone was too sick or scared to move them. The smell hit you first. Even through the herb-packed beak, the stench was overwhelming. Rotting flesh, burst buboes leaking black pus, human waste from patients too weak to reach chamber pots, and the sweet, sick smell of gangrene. The sounds were worse. Constant moaning, delirious screaming, death rattles, and the wet pop of buboes bursting. Some patients begged for death. Others begged for life. Many just begged for water, which was often denied because medieval medicine believed that drinking water during fever would make it worse. The plague doctor would move through this hellscape with his stick, checking patients one by one. Temperature was assessed by hovering a hand near the forehead, never touching. Buboes were examined from a distance, their size and color noted. Black meant death was imminent. Red meant there was hope. Purple meant nobody really knew, but it probably wasn't good. The stick would prod swellings to check their firmness, a process that caused excruciating pain and sometimes caused buboes to burst, spraying infected material across the room. Treatment options were limited and largely useless. Bloodletting remained popular despite its complete ineffectiveness. The plague doctor would direct assistants to open veins or apply leeches, carefully staying out of blood spray range. Some doctors practiced bubo lancing, cutting open the swellings to drain them. This occasionally helped if the patient didn't die from shock, blood loss, or secondary infection, which they usually did. The success rate was approximately the same as doing nothing, but at least it looked like medical intervention. Then there were the medicines, and I use that term loosely. Theriac was the most popular, a compound of over 70 ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, and fermented herbs that took months to prepare and cost more than most people's annual income. It did absolutely nothing for plague, but the opium probably made dying more pleasant. Powdered emerald was prescribed for wealthy patients, based on the logic that something so expensive must be medically valuable. Crushed pearls mixed with rose water was another favorite, turning dying into a luxury experience. For poorer patients, the treatments were more creative. Urine baths were recommended by some doctors who believed that the ammonia would draw out the plague poison. Patients would sit in tubs of human urine, sometimes their own, sometimes collected from healthy people who sold it for a modest fee. The practice of rubbing dried toads on buboes was also popular. The toads had to be dried in a specific way, hung by their legs during a full moon, because medieval medicine was nothing if not specific about its nonsense. After the hospital rounds came house calls, which were arguably worse. At least in the plague hospitals, everyone was already infected. House calls meant entering homes where plague was just beginning its work, where terrified families would do anything to save their loved ones, where the doctor might be walking into a trap of disease and desperation. The plague doctor would be escorted by city guards, partly for protection and partly to enforce quarantine orders. The examinations were perfunctory. Walk in, poke the patient with the stick, look at any visible buboes, declare them infected or not, and get out. If plague was confirmed, the entire house would be sealed. A red cross would be painted on the door along with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Guards would be posted to ensure nobody left. Food would be delivered through windows. And everyone inside would wait to see who lived and who died. The plague doctor's diagnosis was effectively a death sentence for entire families. Record-keeping was another crucial duty. Plague doctors maintained detailed logs of the infected, the recovered, and the dead. These death certificates were often the only official record that someone had existed. The doctor would note the name, address, occupation, approximate age, and manner of death. Tokens meant bubonic plague. Spotted fever meant septicemic plague. Lung plague meant pneumonic plague. Sudden death meant they died too fast to categorize. These records are now invaluable historical documents, though at the time they were mostly used to track property inheritance and tax obligations. The plague doctor was also responsible for autopsies, though calling them autopsies gives them too much credit. These were more like ritualized corpse mutilations performed by someone who didn't understand human anatomy, but felt obligated to look for answers. They'd cut open bodies looking for signs of divine punishment or evidence of sin made physical. Black organs were interpreted as moral corruption. Enlarged spleens were signs of excessive anger. Diseased lungs meant the victim had breathed in evil vapors. None of this advanced medical knowledge, but it did provide grieving families with explanations, however nonsensical. One of the most disturbing duties was supervising the disposal of bodies. During peak plague years, cities could produce hundreds of corpses daily. Normal burial practices collapsed completely. Plague pits were dug, massive trenches where bodies were stacked like cordwood and covered with quicklime. The plague doctor would oversee these mass burials, ensuring bodies were disposed of quickly enough to prevent even more disease. They'd stand at the edge of the pit, that beaked figure watching as cartloads of the dead were dumped unceremoniously into the earth. The psychological manipulation was sometimes part of the job, too. Plague doctors were expected to maintain public order through fear and authority. They'd make pronouncements about the plague's progress, always vague enough to avoid being proven wrong. They'd recommend citywide prayers or processions, not because they helped medically, but because they gave people something to do besides panic. Some doctors invented elaborate rituals around their treatments, knowing that the performance of medicine was sometimes as important as actual medicine, especially when actual medicine didn't exist. They also served as negotiators between the living and the dying. Wealthy patients would bribe plague doctors to provide better care or at least more comfortable deaths. Families would pay for favorable diagnoses that might spare them from quarantine. City officials would pressure doctors to underreport death tolls to prevent total panic. The plague doctor had to navigate these competing interests while trying not to die themselves, a balancing act that required political skills no medical school taught. The isolation of the job was crushing. Plague doctors couldn't visit taverns, attend church, or participate in any normal social activities. They were required to carry white sticks or canes to warn healthy people away. Some cities required them to ring bells as they walked, like lepers, announcing their contaminated presence. They lived in separate quarters, often abandoned houses marked for demolition. Their only regular human contact was with other plague workers, gravediggers, corpse carriers, and nurses who were usually just desperate people with no other options. Payment was theoretically generous but practically complicated. Cities promised high salaries to attract plague doctors, but collecting payment from a government that might not exist next month was challenging. Some doctors demanded payment in advance. Others accepted property rights to houses whose owners had died. A few entrepreneurial doctors sold miracle cures on the side, patent medicines that were mostly alcohol and hope. The smart ones converted their payment to portable wealth immediately. Gold, jewels, anything that could be carried when fleeing became necessary. The survival rate for plague doctors was surprisingly variable. Some lasted weeks, others worked for years without infection. Nobody knew why. Modern analysis suggests that the leather costume might have provided some protection against flea bites, the actual transmission vector for bubonic plague. The enforced distance from patients helped too. But pneumonic plague, spread through airborne droplets, would have passed right through those herb-stuffed beaks. Many doctors probably survived through pure luck, genetic resistance, or previous exposure that granted immunity. The medical theories plague doctors operated under would make a modern physician laugh, cry, or possibly drink heavily. These weren't just wrong. They were spectacularly, creatively, almost artistically wrong. Yet they were delivered with the absolute confidence that only comes from complete ignorance dressed up as expertise. Understanding these theories is crucial to understanding why plague doctors did what they did, and why their treatments often hastened the deaths they were trying to prevent. The foundation of all plague medicine was humorism, the idea that the human body contained 4 fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Perfect health meant perfect balance between these humors. Disease meant imbalance. The plague obviously was caused by an excess of corrupted humors, probably black bile because the buboes were black, and that seemed logical enough. This meant treatment focused on removing the excess bad humors through bloodletting, purging, vomiting, and sweating. Basically, if fluid could come out of the body, plague doctors wanted it out. But humorism was just the beginning. There was also the miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air or noxious vapors arising from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, or astronomical events. The plague was thought to travel in invisible clouds of corruption that could be blown by wind, trapped in clothing, or lurk in dark corners waiting to infect the unwary. This led to elaborate air purification rituals including burning aromatic woods, carrying pomanders filled with spices, and the famous beak masks that supposedly filtered out the bad air. The astrological component was equally important. Many plague doctors were also astrologers who believed that planetary alignments caused or influenced disease. The conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in 1345 was widely blamed for the Black Death's initial outbreak. Treatment timing was determined by star charts. Bloodletting was only performed when the moon was in the correct phase. Medicines were prepared during favorable planetary aspects. One doctor refused to treat patients on Tuesdays because Mars was dominant, and that meant blood would flow too freely. Then there was the religious dimension. The plague was simultaneously a natural disease that could be treated medically and divine punishment that required spiritual intervention. Plague doctors had to balance these competing explanations without offending either medical or religious authorities. They'd prescribe prayers alongside poultices, recommend confession before surgery, and suggest that moral reform was as important as medical treatment. Some doctors specialized in identifying the specific sins that had caused each patient's infection, creating personalized repentance programs alongside their medical prescriptions. The actual medical procedures were where things got truly creative. Bloodletting was performed with terrifying enthusiasm. The amount of blood to be removed was calculated using complex formulas involving the patient's age, temperament, astrological sign, and the color of their urine. Some doctors removed pints of blood from people already dying from blood loss. They had special knives for different veins, each with its own name and supposed properties. The median cubital vein was for fever, the cephalic vein for headaches, the basilic vein for liver problems. They'd cut multiple veins simultaneously, turning patients into human fountains. Cupping was another favorite technique. Glass or metal cups would be heated and placed on the skin, creating suction as they cooled. This drew blood to the surface, creating large purple welts that were interpreted as extracted poison. Wet cupping involved scarifying the skin first, combining suction with bloodletting in a technique that guaranteed infection if the plague didn't get you first. Some doctors used dozens of cups simultaneously, turning patients into human polka dot patterns. But the real innovation was in the chemical treatments. Mercury was prescribed for everything, despite being a deadly neurotoxin. Patients would drink mercury, bathe in mercury, breathe mercury vapors, and have mercury ointments rubbed into their skin. The resulting mercury poisoning caused tremors, madness, and organ failure, which were interpreted as the plague leaving the body. One doctor's notes cheerfully record that his mercury treatment caused patients to salivate extensively, which he saw as proof that the evil humors were being expelled. Antimony was another popular poison prescribed as medicine. This heavy metal caused violent vomiting, which was exactly what doctors wanted. The theory was that vomiting would expel the corrupted humors from the stomach. Patients would take antimony pills, vomit repeatedly, then collect, clean, and reuse the pills because antimony was expensive. Some families had hereditary antimony pills passed down through generations, which is simultaneously resourceful and horrifying. The herbal remedies were marginally less lethal but equally creative. Theriac, the ultimate cure-all, contained over 70 ingredients including viper's flesh, opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and fermented honey. It took months to prepare properly and cost a fortune. Venice was famous for its theriac, which was prepared in public ceremonies to prevent counterfeiting. The mixture was aged for years, like wine, with older theriac commanding higher prices. Whether it helped with plague is doubtful, but the opium content probably made dying more pleasant. Bezoar stones were another expensive treatment. These were concretions found in animal stomachs, usually goats or deer, believed to be universal antidotes to poison. Wealthy patients would pay enormous sums for genuine bezoars, which would be ground into powder and mixed with wine. The fact that drinking stomach stones didn't cure plague was attributed to either counterfeit bezoars or insufficient faith. Some doctors rented bezoars by the hour, moving the same stone from patient to patient like a medical timeshare. The surgical interventions were particularly brutal. Buboes were treated with everything from hot irons to acid. The theory was that the swellings contained corrupted matter that needed to be expelled or destroyed. Some doctors would lance buboes and pack the wounds with bizarre mixtures. One popular recipe included human feces, which was believed to draw out poison through sympathetic magic. Another involved live leeches inserted directly into the opened bubo, where they would supposedly suck out the bad blood while probably introducing 17 new infections. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was sometimes performed on plague patients with neurological symptoms. The idea was to release evil spirits or pressure from corrupted humors affecting the brain. Patients who survived the actual drilling usually died from the resulting brain infection, but at least their headaches stopped. One doctor proudly recorded that he had performed over 50 trepanations with only 48 deaths, which he considered an excellent success rate. Temperature therapy was another adventure in medical sadism. Patients would be subjected to extreme hot and cold treatments to rebalance their humors. This might involve being wrapped in sheets soaked in ice water, then immediately placed next to roaring fires. Some doctors prescribed snow baths followed by steam treatments. Others had patients drink boiling water while sitting in cold baths. The shock to the system was supposed to reset the humoral balance. It usually just caused cardiac arrest. The dietary prescriptions were equally random. Some doctors forbade all food, believing that eating fed the plague. Others prescribed specific diets based on the patient's astrological sign. Aries patients got ram's meat, Pisces patients got fish, and Taurus patients presumably got beef, though the logic was never clearly explained. One doctor insisted that patients eat only white foods: white bread, white fish, white wine, and milk. Another prescribed only foods that grew upward, believing they would lift the spirits and the disease. Prevention methods were just as creative. Carrying magical amulets was universal. These might contain prayers, planetary symbols, or supposed plague-repelling substances like dried toads or wolf teeth. One popular amulet was the abracadabra triangle, where the word was written repeatedly, with one letter removed each line until only A remained. This was worn around the neck and supposedly filtered out plague vapors through the power of diminishing magic. Cities implemented public health measures based on these theories. Street cleaning focused on removing bad smells rather than actual disease vectors. Huge bonfires were lit to purify the air, sometimes using aromatic woods that cost more than feeding the poor. Animals were banned from cities, except for the rats that actually carried the plague fleas. Public gatherings were forbidden, unless they were religious processions to beg God for mercy, which packed thousands of people together in perfect disease-spreading formation. Let's talk money, because even in the midst of apocalyptic disease, someone was getting paid. The plague economy was a fascinating mixture of disaster capitalism, medical fraud, and desperate municipal financing. Plague doctors sat at the center of this economic whirlpool, simultaneously enriched and impoverished by their profession, making fortunes they often didn't live to spend. The salary structure for plague doctors was unlike anything else in medieval or early modern medicine. Cities offered what seemed like astronomical sums to attract anyone willing to take the job. Venice, in 1630, paid its plague doctors 200 gold ducats annually, about 20 times what a skilled craftsman earned. Toulouse offered even more, plus free housing, plus immunity from taxes, plus the right to charge private patients whatever they wanted. Some cities threw in bonuses for every month survived, creating a grim sort of medical loyalty program where the prize for not dying was more money to not spend because shops wouldn't serve you. But here's where it gets interesting. These salaries were often theoretical. Cities promising gold were themselves decimated by plague, their tax bases evaporating as citizens died or fled. Payment might come in deprecated currency, property deeds to houses no one wanted, or promises of future compensation that assumed both the doctor and the city would exist in the future. Smart plague doctors demanded payment in advance, in portable wealth like gold coins or jewels, and kept their earnings in hidden caches ready for quick escape. Private practice was where the real money was, and the ethical violations were spectacular. Wealthy patients would pay anything for preferential treatment or favorable diagnoses. A plague doctor might charge a year's wages to declare someone's suspicious fever definitely not plague, allowing them to avoid quarantine. Others sold fake certificates of health that allowed merchants to travel between cities. The going rate for declaring a plague death as natural causes, thus avoiding property confiscation and family quarantine, was typically about a month's normal salary paid in gold or goods. The medical fraud was extensive and creative. Plague doctors sold miracle cures that were mostly alcohol and herbs, but marketed with elaborate stories. One doctor claimed his potion contained ground unicorn horn from the Holy Land, blessed by 3 popes and tested on condemned criminals who survived their executions. It was actually chalk and wine, but it sold for the equivalent of a house. Another marketed pills made from the dried hearts of toads caught during eclipses. The toads were real, though whether they were caught during eclipses was debatable, and their medical value was 0. Some plague doctors ran side businesses that complemented their main job, selling burial shrouds to families who wanted their dead wrapped in something better than the standard plague pit sacking, offering expedited death certificates that allowed for quicker property transfer. One entrepreneurial doctor in Milan started a messenger service, carrying letters between quarantined houses for substantial fees. He claimed the letters were purified with special smoke, though his purification process consisted of waving them vaguely near a candle. The corruption went deeper. Plague doctors could condemn property as infected, forcing owners to abandon it, then acquire it themselves through intermediaries. They could declare entire neighborhoods disease-free in exchange for collective bribes. Some ran protection rackets, threatening to declare houses infected unless paid regular fees. One doctor in London was eventually executed for deliberately spreading plague to increase demand for his services, though how he managed this, given that nobody understood disease transmission, is unclear. There was also legitimate commerce around plague medicine. The herb trade exploded during plague years. Prices for medicinal plants increased by factors of hundreds. A pound of myrrh that normally cost a day's wages might sell for a month's income during plague season. Traders who correctly predicted which cities would be hit next could make fortunes importing medicines just ahead of the disease. Some merchants followed plague routes like storm chasers, arriving with wagons full of vinegar, herbs, and hope just as the first cases appeared. The protective equipment industry thrived. Leather workers who normally made shoes and belts shifted to producing plague doctor costumes. The best masks, with properly ground glass lenses and expertly curved beaks, commanded premium prices. One Venetian craftsman claimed his masks were blessed by the Pope and lined with gold leaf for extra protection. They weren't blessed, and the gold was paint, but they sold for 50 times the normal price. Wax producers couldn't keep up with demand for the special coatings that supposedly made leather plague-proof. Even the stick-making business boomed. These weren't just any sticks. They were medical instruments that required proper length, balance, and decoration. Some were topped with silver pomanders containing aromatic substances. Others had hidden compartments for medicines, or, more practically, coins for bribes. The most expensive had mechanical features like extensible tips or built-in bells to warn people away. One doctor commissioned a stick with a hidden blade, though whether for medical purposes or self-defense was never specified. The quarantine economy was its own ecosystem. Guards who enforced household quarantines expected bribes to look the other way when family members snuck out. Food delivery to quarantined houses became a profitable business, with massive markups for the risk and convenience. Some entrepreneurs ran quarantine hotels, private facilities where wealthy families could wait out their isolation in relative comfort instead of being sealed in their potentially infected homes. These charged rates that would make modern luxury resorts blush. Death administration was another profit center. Plague doctors often served as unofficial executors, helping families navigate the legal chaos of mass death. They'd witness wills, notarize property transfers, and certify inheritances, all for appropriate fees. Some became experts in inheritance law, advising families on how to structure their affairs to avoid confiscation if plague struck. Others sold insurance policies, promising to ensure proper burial and estate management if the purchaser died of plague. Whether any of these policies were ever honored is doubtful. The body disposal industry was perhaps the grimmest business of all. Gravediggers, exempt from normal plague restrictions because someone had to do the job, charged whatever the market would bear. During peak plague periods, the cost of even a basic burial could exceed a year's wages. Wealthy families paid fortunes to avoid the plague pits, bribing officials for space in churchyards or private burial grounds. Some gravediggers ran bidding wars between families for the last available plots, auctioning off eternal rest to the highest bidder. Transportation of bodies became specialized work. Corpse carriers, usually condemned criminals or desperates with nothing to lose, charged by the body and distance. They had special carts marked with plague warnings, and their arrival in a neighborhood was the surest sign that death had visited. Some carriers offered express service, guaranteeing same-day removal for premium prices. Others provided discreet service, removing bodies at night to avoid alerting neighbors that plague had struck. The financial records of plague doctors who survived their tenure reveal fascinating details. One doctor in Marseille left an estate worth more than most noble families possessed, accumulated in just 3 years of plague practice. His inventory included hundreds of gold coins from various nations, suggesting an international clientele, jewels supposedly paid by desperate merchants, and property deeds to dozens of houses whose owners had died owing him money. He also owned 17 plague doctor costumes in various states of repair, suggesting either extreme paranoia about protection or a profitable side business in equipment rental. But for every plague doctor who died wealthy, dozens died poor or simply died. The job's mortality rate meant that accumulating wealth was meaningless if you didn't survive to spend it. Some doctors spent their earnings immediately on whatever pleasures were available to social pariahs. Others sent money to families they could never visit. A few donated everything to churches, hoping to buy divine protection or at least a better afterlife. The smart ones converted their wealth to portable forms and kept escape routes ready, knowing that a plague doctor who stayed too long eventually became a patient. The economic impact of plague doctors extended beyond their immediate transactions. They were often the only functioning government officials during outbreaks, making economic decisions that affected entire cities. They might declare markets closed or open, determine which businesses could operate, or decide whether trade could continue. These decisions, supposedly based on medical knowledge but often influenced by bribes or personal interest, could make or break fortunes. To understand the plague doctor's world, you need to understand what a plague city actually looked like, smelled like, sounded like. These weren't just cities with some sick people. They were transformed into entirely different organisms, cities where the normal rules of civilization had dissolved and been replaced by something between martial law and complete anarchy. The plague doctor walked through these urban nightmares daily, the leather beak becoming less costume and more necessary armor against a world gone mad. First, the silence. That's what survivors always mentioned first. Cities that had buzzed with commerce, conversation, and life became quiet as tombs. Markets that had echoed with haggling voices stood empty. Streets that had clattered with cartwheels and horse hooves were still. Churches that had rung bells every hour stopped because the bell ringers were dead or fled. The only sounds were the things you didn't want to hear: the moaning of the sick, the wailing of the bereaved, the rumble of death carts, and the flutter of ravens that had learned to associate human settlements with easily available meat. The visual landscape was equally transformed. Every infected house bore a red cross painted on the door, usually with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," scrawled beneath. These weren't small, discreet markings. They were huge, aggressive warnings painted in pig's blood or red ochre that dripped like accusations. Some cities required infected houses to hang bundles of straw from their windows. Others demanded white cloths or particular symbols. By the height of an outbreak, entire streets would be marked, creating corridors of visible doom that even illiterate citizens could read. The quarantine seals were heavy wooden planks nailed across doors and windows. Once a house was sealed, nobody could leave for 40 days, the origin of our word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni. Guards were posted outside, though finding men willing to stand watch at plague houses required either substantial payment or using condemned criminals who chose pest house duty over execution. These guards weren't just keeping the infected in, they were keeping everyone else out, preventing looting, enforcing isolation, and occasionally fighting off desperate family members trying to escape or enter. Bodies became part of the urban landscape. During peak infection periods, corpse removal couldn't keep pace with death. Bodies would lie in streets for days, bloating in the sun, providing feast for rats and birds. Some were simply pushed out of windows when families were too weak or frightened to carry them downstairs. Others were stacked outside doors like cordwood, waiting for collection. The death carts would come eventually, announced by bells and cries of, "Bring out your dead," but never often enough. The corpse carriers, drunk on alcohol and proximity to death, would sling bodies into their carts with hooks, not bothering to check if the victims were actually dead. The smell was beyond description, though many tried. Contemporary accounts speak of a sweetish, cloying stench that stuck to everything. It was the smell of rotting flesh, burst buboes leaking black pus, human waste from houses where nobody was strong enough to empty chamber pots, and the acrid smoke from constant fires burning clothes, bedding, and anything else that might carry infection. Over it all hung the artificial sense of attempted prevention. Vinegar splashed on walls, aromatic herbs burning in streets, and the pomanders carried by anyone who could afford them. The mixture created an olfactory assault that survivors claimed never fully left their nostrils. Water systems collapsed quickly. Wells were suspected of carrying plague, so people avoided them. Public fountains were shut down to prevent gatherings. The river water was full of corpses upstream. This left cities dependent on whatever water had been stored before the outbreak, usually in barrels that quickly became breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other insects. The lack of clean water meant no washing, no cleaning, no cooking in many cases. Cities that had prided themselves on their public baths and fountains became deserts of filth. Food distribution was equally problematic. Markets were closed to prevent crowds. Farmers wouldn't enter cities to sell produce. Bakers fled or died, leaving no one to make bread. What food remained was either hoarded by the wealthy or sold at prices that would have caused riots in normal times. But these weren't normal times. People paid anything for food that wasn't potentially contaminated. A loaf of bread might cost a month's wages. A chicken, if you could find one, was worth its weight in silver. Some enterprising criminals sold plague-free food that was actually stolen from infected houses, spreading disease to desperate purchasers. The animals added their own horror to the scene. Dogs and cats were killed en masse, suspected of carrying plague. Their bodies were burned in great pyres that added to the smoke hanging over cities. But killing the cats meant rat populations exploded, and while nobody understood that rats carried the fleas that actually spread plague, everyone noticed that cities suddenly swarmed with bold, daylight-active rats that showed no fear of humans. Pigs, which normally served as garbage disposal in medieval cities, were also eliminated. Without them, waste accumulated in streets, creating perfect breeding grounds for disease. Horses presented a particular problem. When their owners died, horses were often locked in stables with no one to feed or water them. Their screaming could be heard for days before they finally died. Then their corpses would rot in place because nobody wanted to risk entering a plague victim's stable. Some horses escaped and wandered the streets, adding a surreal element to the urban nightmare. Accounts describe wild-eyed horses galloping through empty markets, their hooves echoing off abandoned stalls. The social fabric didn't just fray, it shredded completely. Parents abandoned infected children. Children fled from dying parents. Spouses refused to nurse each other. Servants robbed their masters and vanished. The normal bonds of family, friendship, and community dissolved in the acid of terror. One chronicler wrote that the plague killed not just bodies but souls, turning humans into selfish animals concerned only with their own survival. Crime took new forms. Plague spreaders were rumored to exist, people who deliberately infected others for pay or madness. Whether real or imagined, the fear of them was genuine. Anyone acting suspiciously near wells or food supplies might be beaten or killed by mobs. Some criminals specialized in robbing infected houses, knowing the inhabitants were too weak to resist. Others posed as plague doctors, using fake costumes to gain entry to homes they could loot. The real plague doctors had to carry official documents and seals, though forgeries were common. Religious responses varied wildly. Some churches held constant services, believers packed together praying for deliverance, creating perfect conditions for disease spread. Others locked their doors entirely, priests fleeing or hiding. Flagellant processions wound through streets, believers whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath. These processions were banned in many cities, not for health reasons, but because authorities feared they might trigger riots. Impromptu preachers appeared on street corners, declaring the plague everything from divine punishment to the beginning of the apocalypse. The economic life of cities simply stopped. Shops closed because owners died or fled. Workshops stood empty, tools abandoned mid-task. Construction projects were left half-finished, scaffolding standing like skeletons against buildings that would never be completed. Money itself became almost meaningless. What good was gold when there was nothing to buy and no one to buy from? Some transactions reverted to pure barter: food for medicine, water for protection, burial services for whatever the dead had left behind. The psychological atmosphere was perhaps the strangest element. A combination of fatalism and hysteria gripped populations. Some people became completely reckless, drinking and carousing in taverns that remained open, reasoning that they might as well enjoy their last days. Others became paranoid recluses, sealing themselves in rooms and refusing all human contact. Mass psychogenic symptoms appeared, people claiming to feel plague symptoms when they were healthy, or conversely, refusing to acknowledge obvious infection because admitting sickness meant certain quarantine and probable death. Into this nightmare world walked the plague doctor, the leather-beaked figure who somehow had to maintain not just medical services but some semblance of order. They were often the only authority figures who hadn't fled, making them de facto governors of dying cities. They had to decide which districts to quarantine, which houses to condemn, which bodies to burn, and which to bury. They became judges determining who lived and who was left to die, economists managing collapsed markets, and priests providing last rites when clergy wouldn't come. The plague doctor's rounds through these cities were processionals of horror. Starting before dawn to avoid the worst of the smell and heat, they would move from house to marked house, their white sticks tap-tap-tapping on cobblestones to warn any survivors to stay away. Behind them might follow a small entourage, guards to enforce their orders, assistants to carry medical supplies, and sometimes corpse carriers ready to remove the bodies the doctor pronounced dead. This grim parade would wind through empty streets. the only movement in cities that had become still-life portraits of catastrophe. The psychological toll of being a plague doctor was something no medical training could prepare you for, mainly because medical training didn't include psychology and barely included medicine. These men, and they were almost always men, found themselves isolated not just from healthy society, but from normal human experience. They lived in a parallel world where death was the default and survival was the aberration. It's no wonder that many plague doctors developed what we would now recognize as severe mental illness, though at the time it was just considered an occupational hazard, like catching plague, but for your mind. The isolation was total and crushing. From the moment you put on the leather suit, you ceased to be a normal member of society. You couldn't enter taverns, attend church, visit markets, or maintain normal relationships. Your presence cleared streets faster than actual plague warnings. Mothers would grab children and run inside at the sight of you. Dogs would bark and cower. Even other medical professionals avoided you because proximity to a plague doctor was considered almost as dangerous as proximity to plague itself. Living arrangements reflected this pariah status. Plague doctors were usually housed in abandoned buildings on the edges of cities, places where the previous occupants had died or fled. These weren't comfortable accommodations. They were half-ruined structures with leaking roofs and broken windows, chosen specifically because nobody else wanted them. Some doctors tried to make these spaces livable, setting up makeshift laboratories and libraries. Others simply existed in squalor, reasoning that comfort was pointless when death might come tomorrow. The daily routine was an exercise in psychological endurance. Wake before dawn in your isolated quarters. Spend an hour putting on the leather costume, checking every seal and strap, because a single gap might mean death. Fill your beak with fresh herbs and vinegar, trying not to think about how useless they probably were. Then walk through empty streets to begin rounds at the plague hospitals, where you'd spend 8 to 12 hours surrounded by death, suffering, and the knowledge that most of your treatments were making things worse. The constant exposure to death created a peculiar form of emotional numbness. Plague doctors described becoming unable to feel normal emotions. Joy, sadness, fear, and even disgust eventually faded into a gray emotional landscape where nothing really mattered. One doctor wrote in his journal that he could watch children die without feeling anything, then immediately noted that this lack of feeling disturbed him more than the deaths themselves. This emotional numbing was probably a protective mechanism, but it came at the cost of basic humanity. Some doctors went the opposite direction, becoming hyper-emotional and unstable. They'd swing between manic energy and crushing depression, sometimes within the same day. These mood swings were exacerbated by the common practice of self-medication with alcohol and opium. Many plague doctors stayed perpetually intoxicated, reasoning that being drunk was better than being sober in hell. The combination of isolation, constant death, and substance abuse created perfect conditions for psychological breakdown. Paranoia was universal. Every itch might be the beginning of infection. Every cough could be your death sentence. Plague doctors obsessively checked themselves for symptoms, sometimes dozens of times per day. They'd examine their own urine, palpate their own lymph nodes, and monitor their temperature with the limited tools available. Some kept detailed journals of their physical condition, recording every minor symptom in case it might be significant. These journals make for disturbing reading, documenting the slow dissolution of rationality under extreme stress. The relationship with death became complicated and often disturbing. Some plague doctors developed what we would now call thanatophilia, a fascination with death that went beyond professional interest. They'd spend hours examining corpses not for medical knowledge but from morbid curiosity. They'd collect specimens, preserved organs, or particularly interesting buboes, creating grotesque museums in their quarters. One doctor in Prague kept detailed drawings of every corpse he examined, eventually accumulating thousands of death portraits that he claimed were for medical study, but which seemed more like obsessive documentation of decay. Religious experiences, both conventional and decidedly not, were common. Some plague doctors became intensely devout, seeing their work as a divine calling. They'd pray constantly, wear religious symbols under their leather suits, and interpret every survival as divine intervention. Others went the opposite direction, becoming atheistic or even actively anti-religious, unable to reconcile the suffering they witnessed with the existence of a benevolent deity. A few developed entirely new religious ideas, creating personal cosmologies where plague was a cleansing force or where they themselves were prophets of a new order. Delusions of grandeur were occupational hazards. When you're the only medical authority in a dying city, when your word can condemn families to quarantine or spare them, when desperate people treat you like you hold the power of life and death because you literally do, it's easy to develop an inflated sense of importance. Some plague doctors began referring to themselves in the third person or adopting royal pretensions. One doctor in Venice insisted on being called His Medical Excellency and demanded that people bow when he passed. Another claimed he could cure plague through touch alone, charging enormous fees for laying his gloved hands on patients. The opposite delusion was equally common, the belief that they were already dead. Some plague doctors became convinced they had died and were now ghosts or demons walking the earth. This delusion, now known as Cotard's syndrome, led to bizarre behaviors. Doctors would stop eating because dead people don't need food. They'd ignore injuries because corpses don't feel pain. One doctor spent weeks trying to find his own grave, convinced he must be buried somewhere since he was clearly deceased. Sexual dysfunction and deviation were rarely discussed but clearly common. The combination of isolation, constant proximity to death, and social ostracism created unhealthy psychological conditions. Some plague doctors developed necrophilic tendencies, though actually acting on such impulses would have been additionally dangerous given the infectious nature of plague corpses. Others became celibate, viewing sex as another form of human contact that might transmit disease. A few went to the opposite extreme, visiting brothels while still wearing their plague costumes, creating scenes that must have been simultaneously terrifying and pathetic. The development of what we would now recognize as PTSD was inevitable. Plague doctors experienced constant trauma with no opportunity for recovery or processing. They witnessed suffering on an unimaginable scale, made life and death decisions with inadequate information, and lived in constant fear for their own lives. The symptoms they described match modern PTSD perfectly: nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbing, hypervigilance, and dissociation. But without any understanding of psychological trauma, these symptoms were usually attributed to moral weakness or divine punishment. Some doctors developed elaborate coping rituals that bordered on obsessive-compulsive behavior. One doctor in Milan had to touch every doorframe 3 times before entering a room. Another counted his steps, convinced that certain numbers were protective against plague. These rituals provided an illusion of control in an uncontrollable situation. They were magical thinking dressed up as medical practice, but they probably helped maintain sanity in an insane world. The use of substances to cope was almost universal. Alcohol was the most common, with many plague doctors drinking continuously throughout their working day. Wine was believed to have protective properties against plague, which provided a convenient medical excuse for constant intoxication. Opium and its derivatives were also popular, originally used to treat plague symptoms but increasingly consumed by the doctors themselves. Some experimented with more exotic substances: mercury vapors for their supposed purifying properties, various herbal concoctions that produced altered states, and occasionally substances we would now recognize as hallucinogens. The treatments plague doctors administered were a spectacular collection of human creativity gone wrong, desperation dressed up as medicine, and occasionally accidental insights wrapped in so much nonsense that any benefit was purely coincidental. These weren't just ineffective treatments. They were often actively harmful, turning plague hospitals into torture chambers where the cure was frequently worse than the disease. Understanding these treatments requires temporarily abandoning modern medical knowledge and trying to think like someone who believed disease was caused by bad smells and planetary misalignment. Let's start with the most famous treatment: lancing the buboes. The theory was simple enough. Those huge, painful swellings clearly contained bad stuff that needed to come out. So plague doctors would take a sharp knife, usually heated in fire because hot things were believed to have purifying properties, and slice open the buboes to drain them. The patient would scream, obviously, but that was considered a good sign because it meant they still had enough life force to feel pain. The buboes would drain a mixture of blood, pus, and necrotic tissue that smelled like death marinated in sewage. Success, except not really. While draining buboes might occasionally have provided some relief if they were about to burst anyway, the procedure usually just introduced new infections into already compromised immune systems. The knives were never properly sterilized because germ theory didn't exist. They might be wiped on the doctor's leather coat between patients, spreading infection from one person to the next. The wounds were often packed with various substances that ranged from useless to actively harmful. Spider webs, believed to have binding properties, moldy bread, accidentally antibacterial but usually just moldy, or human feces, based on the theory that like cures like. The position of the buboes created additional problems. Neck buboes were relatively easy to access but dangerously close to major blood vessels. One wrong cut and the patient would bleed out in minutes. Groin buboes were awkward to treat and prone to catastrophic infection. Armpit buboes were so painful that patients would often fight doctors trying to treat them, leading to accidents with those hot knives. Some doctors developed special restraint systems to hold patients still during bubo lancing, turning medical treatment into something resembling torture. Then there was the precision bloodletting, which took the already questionable practice of bleeding sick people and added layers of complexity that would make modern physicians weep. The amount of blood to be removed was calculated using the patient's astrological chart, the color and consistency of their urine, the day of the week, and the doctor's interpretation of their dreams. One medical text specified that plague patients born under Mars should lose 2 pints of blood from the left arm on Tuesdays, while those born under Venus needed only 1 pint from the right arm on Fridays. The bloodletting tools were works of art and horror. Fleams were special knives with multiple blades of different sizes, each supposedly suited for different veins and conditions. Scarificators were spring-loaded devices with multiple blades that would slice several cuts simultaneously. Some doctors used special bleeding bowls marked with measurements and astrological symbols, turning blood loss into a ritualistic performance. The blood itself was sometimes examined for signs, though what signs they were looking for in the blood of dying people remains unclear. Cupping, both dry and wet, reached new heights of complexity during plague outbreaks. Doctors would cover patients with dozens of cups, creating patterns that supposedly corresponded to the flow of corrupted humors through the body. Some developed special plague cupping protocols that required cups to be placed in specific sequences, held for precise durations, and removed in particular orders. One doctor claimed his 17-cup spiral pattern, when applied counterclockwise during a waning moon, could draw out plague poison through the skin. Patients looked like they'd been attacked by a very organized octopus. The chemical treatments were where things got truly creative. Mercury, that beautiful liquid metal that we now know causes madness and death, was administered in every conceivable way. Patients drank mercury mixed with wine, breathed mercury vapors from special fumigation tents, had mercury ointments rubbed into their skin, and sometimes sat in mercury baths. The resulting mercury poisoning caused excessive salivation, which doctors interpreted as the body expelling plague poison. The tremors, hallucinations, and organ failure that followed were seen as the plague fighting back before being defeated. Antimony, another toxic metal, was prescribed as an emetic. The goal was to make patients vomit so violently that they would expel the corrupted humors causing plague. Antimony pills were so effective at causing vomiting that they could be retrieved from vomit or feces, cleaned and reused. Some families had hereditary antimony pills passed down through generations like treasured heirlooms. This pill killed your grandfather, and his father before him was apparently considered a selling point rather than a warning. Arsenic made appearances in various plague cures, usually in small doses that probably only caused mild poisoning rather than death. One popular preparation combined arsenic with ground pearls and gold leaf, creating an expensive poison that at least killed you with style. The logic was that arsenic's preservation properties, it prevents decay in corpses, might prevent the body from succumbing to plague's corruption. The fact that it prevented decay by killing tissue didn't seem to bother anyone. The herbal remedies ranged from potentially helpful to definitely hallucinogenic. Willow bark, which contains aspirin-like compounds, might have reduced fever and pain. But it was usually combined with so many other ingredients that any benefit was lost. One popular plague remedy contained over 40 herbs, including several that we now know are toxic, mixed with wine and aged in a horse skull for a full lunar month. The preparation instructions read like a witch's spell, which might have been the point. Some doctors prescribed medicines based on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God marked plants with signs indicating their medical use. Plants with black spots were used to treat buboes because they looked similar. Yellow flowers treated jaundice. Red plants were good for blood diseases. One doctor insisted that walnuts, which resemble brains, could cure the delirium associated with plague. He prescribed a diet of nothing but walnuts for delirious patients, who probably became even more delirious from malnutrition. Animal-based treatments were particularly grotesque. Live pigeons were cut in half and applied to buboes while still warm and twitching. The theory was that the dying bird would draw out the plague poison in its final moments. Puppies and kittens were similarly sacrificed and applied to swellings. One doctor specialized in what he called therapeutic saprophagy, feeding patients controlled amounts of rotting meat to accustom the body to corruption. The resulting food poisoning was interpreted as the treatment working. The placement of dried toads on buboes deserves special mention. These weren't just any toads. They had to be captured during specific astrological conditions, killed in prescribed ways, and dried according to elaborate protocols. Some doctors insisted the toads had to be caught during thunderstorms because lightning charged them with healing power. Others required toads that had been fed only on herbs for a month before killing. The dried toad would be ground into powder or applied whole to the infected area, where it supposedly absorbed plague poison. Patients often died wearing necklaces of dried toads, looking like victims of the world's worst fashion trend. Temperature therapies reached extremes that would constitute torture by modern standards. Patients were wrapped in sheets soaked in ice water, then placed next to roaring fires. The shock was supposed to break the fever. Some doctors prescribed alternating hot and cold baths, switching patients between near boiling and near freezing water every few minutes. Others believed in graduated temperature therapy, slowly raising or lowering the patient's temperature over hours. One innovative doctor created a special plague sauna where patients were steamed with vinegar vapors while sitting in ice baths, combining multiple useless treatments into one spectacular failure. Money makes the world go round, even when that world is ending. The plague economy was capitalism's darkest hour and finest moment simultaneously, a free market fever dream where supply and demand curves looked like cemetery statistics. Plague doctors stood at the center of this economic maelstrom, simultaneously enriched and impoverished, powerful and powerless, essential workers in the most literal sense before essential workers were a category. Understanding the money behind the beak reveals just how much human greed thrives even when humans themselves are dying by the thousands. The base salary numbers were staggering by period standards. A plague doctor in Venice during the 1630 outbreak earned 200 gold ducats annually. To put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn 10 ducats a year, a university professor 20. A plague doctor made more in a month than most people saw in a lifetime. But here's the catch. That lifetime might only be a few more weeks. It was hazard pay in the most extreme sense, a salary that assumed you probably wouldn't live to spend it. Cities competed for plague doctors like modern tech companies compete for engineers, except the signing bonus might be your death certificate. Marseille offered 300 florins plus housing. Milan countered with 400 plus tax exemption. One desperate German city promised 500 florins, a house, a horse, and the right to inherit property from patients who died without heirs, which was basically everyone. Bidding wars erupted between cities, with plague doctors abandoning contracts mid-outbreak for better offers elsewhere, leaving cities to die while chasing the next paycheck. But the real money wasn't in salaries. It was in the side hustles, the gray market medicine that flourished when official medicine failed. Private consultations were where plague doctors made their fortunes. A wealthy merchant might pay a year's middle-class income for a single house visit. Nobles paid in jewels and gold for exclusive treatment plans that were just as useless as what the poor received, but came with better bedside manner. One doctor in Paris reportedly earned more from 3 private patients than his entire annual city salary. The diagnostic fee structure was particularly creative. Basic examination, 1 gold coin. Detailed examination with urine analysis, 3 gold coins. Examination with astrological consultation, 5 gold coins. Examination with guarantee of non-plague diagnosis regardless of actual symptoms. Price negotiable but always astronomical. That last service was perhaps the most valuable. A certificate of health from a plague doctor could mean the difference between quarantine and freedom, between keeping your business open and watching it die. The medicine trade was pure price gouging elevated to an art form. Theriac, that miraculous cure-all that cured nothing, sold for its weight in silver during plague outbreaks. A single dose cost a month's wages for a laborer. A full course of treatment cost more than a house. The ingredients were supposedly rare and exotic. Viper's flesh from specific valleys, opium from particular poppies, honey from bees that fed only on thyme. In reality, it was usually local snake, whatever opiates were available, and regular honey with some herbs thrown in. But desperate people don't check authenticity certificates. Plague doctors often controlled the entire supply chain. They'd buy herbs and materials during non-plague times when prices were low, stockpile them, then sell their own medicines at massive markups during outbreaks. One doctor in London owned warehouses full of vinegar, which he sold at a 2,000% markup during the 1665 plague. He also owned the shops that sold the bottles, the carts that delivered them, and probably would have owned the fear that drove sales if he could have figured out how to bottle that too. The equipment market was equally lucrative. A proper plague doctor costume cost as much as a small house. The leather had to be specially treated, the glass lenses properly ground, the beak correctly curved. Knockoff costumes flooded the market, made from inferior materials that provided no protection. Not that the real ones provided much either, but authenticity mattered when your life was on the line. Plague doctors often had exclusive deals with specific craftsmen, taking commissions on every costume sold. The stick market deserves special mention. These weren't just walking sticks. They were medical instruments, status symbols, and weapons. High-end sticks were works of art. Carved wood, silver fittings, hidden compartments for medicines or money. Some had mechanical features like extendable tips for reaching into second-story windows or spring-loaded ends for, well, nobody really knew what for, but they were expensive, so people bought them. A top-tier plague stick could cost more than a horse. Then there was the death paperwork economy. Plague doctors were often the only officials authorized to issue death certificates, and these documents were essential for inheritance, property transfer, and remarriage. The standard fee was already substantial, but expedited service cost extra. Want the death certificate today instead of next week? That'll be double. Need the cause of death listed as something other than plague to avoid property quarantine? Triple. Want multiple copies because you don't trust your relatives? Quadruple. The quarantine economy was its own ecosystem of corruption and commerce. Plague doctors could condemn or clear properties, and this power was infinitely monetizable. A favorable inspection that allowed a business to stay open was worth a fortune. An unfavorable one that forced a competitor to close was worth even more. Some doctors ran protection rackets, charging monthly fees to keep properties off the quarantine list. Others took bribes to declare infected houses clean, spreading disease but spreading their wealth even faster. The burial business was perhaps the grimmest profit center. During peak plague years, normal burial became impossible. Churchyards filled up. Gravediggers died or fled. Prices skyrocketed. Plague doctors often controlled access to burial sites, taking commissions from both grieving families and gravediggers. Want your loved one in consecrated ground instead of a plague pit? The plague doctor could arrange it, for a price. Want a proper funeral instead of anonymous disposal? That could be arranged too if you could afford it. Some plague doctors innovated entirely new revenue streams. One enterprising doctor in Amsterdam started a plague insurance scheme. For a monthly fee, he guaranteed treatment if you caught plague, proper burial if you died, and care for your orphans if your entire family perished. He collected premiums from thousands of people, provided services to dozens, and retired wealthy to the countryside when the plague ended. Whether this was insurance or exploitation depends on your perspective on capitalism during catastrophes. The international trade in plague doctors was fascinating. Experienced doctors could command enormous fees to relocate to newly infected cities. Venice would send recruiters to poach doctors from Milan. Paris would offer citizenship and nobility to lure doctors from London. Some doctors became plague mercenaries, following outbreaks across Europe, accumulating wealth and probably spreading disease as they went. They were the world's most dangerous migrant workers. The corruption was systematic and spectacular. Plague doctors would diagnose wealthy enemies with plague to force them into quarantine, then acquire their property through intermediaries. They'd declare their own properties plague-free while condemning neighboring buildings to drive down prices for acquisition. Some ran insider trading schemes, using their knowledge of which districts would be quarantined next to manipulate property and commodity markets. But the most insidious corruption was in the treatment itself. Plague doctors knew most of their remedies were useless. The smart ones knew that bloodletting and mercury were probably harmful. But they continued prescribing them because that's what people expected, what they would pay for. Admitting ignorance meant losing income. So they maintained the theater of medicine, charging fortunes for treatments they knew were worthless, because the alternative was admitting that nobody knew anything about plague except that it killed you. Being a plague doctor meant existing in a social limbo that was simultaneously powerful and powerless, respected and reviled, essential and untouchable. You were the most important person in a dying city and the last person anyone wanted to see. You could enter any home, but were welcome in none. You wielded the power of life and death, but couldn't buy bread without people fleeing in terror. It was a unique social position that created unique psychological pressures and occasionally unique opportunities. The isolation started the moment you accepted the position. Friends would cut contact immediately. Family might disown you, or at least refuse to see you until the plague ended, if it ever did. Your previous life effectively ended. One doctor wrote in his diary that becoming a plague doctor was like attending your own funeral, except you had to keep walking around afterward, a ghost that everyone could see but nobody wanted to acknowledge. The white stick or cane that plague doctors were required to carry was more than a medical tool. It was a social barrier made physical. In many cities, plague doctors had to announce their presence by ringing bells or calling out warnings. They walked in the middle of streets because walking near buildings might contaminate them. People would cross themselves when they passed, throw salt over their shoulders or spit to ward off evil. Children were told that if they misbehaved, the plague doctor would come for them, turning medical professionals into childhood bogeymen. Housing was a constant problem. No landlord wanted to rent to a plague doctor. No neighbors wanted one living nearby. Most ended up in abandoned buildings on the outskirts of towns, places where previous occupants had died or fled. These weren't homes. They were basically camping in ruins. Some doctors tried to make these spaces livable, setting up laboratories and libraries. Others just existed in squalor, reasoning that comfort was pointless when death might come tomorrow. The daily routine reinforced the isolation. Plague doctors often worked at night to avoid crowds, examining bodies by candlelight, making their rounds when streets were empty except for criminals and the desperate. They ate alone, usually food left outside their quarters by brave or well-paid servants. They couldn't attend religious services, couldn't visit markets, couldn't participate in any of the social rituals that made life bearable. They were professionally alive, but socially dead. Yet this isolation came with unexpected freedoms. Plague doctors were exempt from many social rules because they were already outside society. They could enter any building, speak to anyone regardless of social class, and access information that would normally be private. They became confessors to the dying, who would tell them secrets they wouldn't tell priests. They witnessed wills, heard family scandals, learned business secrets. They were walking repositories of information that everyone was dying to keep hidden, literally. Some plague doctors used this position for good, or at least their version of it. They'd carry messages between quarantined houses, reunite separated families, or provide last words to loved ones. Others used it for profit, selling secrets, blackmailing families, or using inside information for financial gain. The ethical boundaries were as blurred as everything else during plague times. The relationship with authority was particularly complex. Plague doctors were technically city employees, but they operated with unusual autonomy. They could quarantine houses, condemn buildings, and restrict movement. They were often the only functioning government officials during severe outbreaks. This made them powerful, but also vulnerable. City councils that fled to the countryside would issue orders from safety, demanding plague doctors enforce increasingly harsh measures while offering no support. The interaction with other medical professionals was strained at best. Proper physicians, the university-educated ones who fled at the first sign of plague, looked down on plague doctors as quacks and opportunists. Barber surgeons saw them as competition. Apothecaries resented their control over medicine distribution. Plague doctors existed in a professional no-man's land, too medical for regular society, but not medical enough for the medical establishment. Women presented a particular social challenge. Plague doctors couldn't court, couldn't marry, couldn't maintain any normal romantic relationships. Some cities actually prohibited plague doctors from marrying during their service. The combination of social isolation, constant death, and enforced celibacy created unhealthy psychological conditions. Some doctors visited brothels while still wearing their costumes, creating scenes that must have been simultaneously pathetic and terrifying. Others formed relationships with plague nurses or other plague workers, finding companionship among the similarly condemned. The economic relationships were equally weird. Plague doctors were often the richest people in cities where money meant nothing. They accumulated wealth from dead patients but had nowhere to spend it. Shops wouldn't serve them, taverns wouldn't admit them. They'd pay servants excessive wages just to have human contact, even if that contact was just someone leaving food at their door. One doctor wrote about paying a fortune for a conversation, bribing a guard to talk to him for an hour about anything except plague. The power dynamics created surreal situations. Plague doctors could condemn nobles to quarantine, but couldn't buy bread from bakers. They could order mass burials, but couldn't attend regular funerals. They were simultaneously the most powerful and most powerless people in the city. This paradox created psychological stress that many doctors couldn't handle. Some became tyrants, using their limited power cruelly because it was the only power they had. Others became doormats, accepting abuse because any human interaction was better than none. And so we come to the end of our journey through one of history's strangest professions, the plague doctor. That leather-wrapped, herb-breathing, stick-wielding figure who walked through humanity's darkest hours with nothing but misguided medical theories and desperate courage. They weren't heroes in any traditional sense. Most were opportunists, failures, or simply desperate people who chose probable death over certain starvation. Their treatments killed more often than they cured. Their theories were spectacularly wrong. Their costumes, those iconic beaked masks that have haunted our collective imagination for centuries, were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how disease actually worked. But here's the thing about the plague doctors that we often forget in our modern, medically sophisticated world. They showed up. When cities were dying, when proper physicians fled, when governments collapsed and society dissolved into chaos, these weird, probably drunk, definitely traumatized individuals put on their ridiculous bird costumes and walked into hell. They counted the dead when everyone else was running from them. They provided last rites when priests wouldn't come. They maintained some semblance of medical authority when medicine itself had failed completely. Were they corrupt? Absolutely. Did they profit from misery? Without question. Did they spread as much disease as they treated? Probably. But they also represented something fundamentally human. The refusal to give up even when giving up would be the rational response. In cities where 90% of the population was dying, where bodies rotted in streets and children were abandoned by terrified parents, plague doctors maintained the fiction that medicine could help, that civilization hadn't completely collapsed, that someone, anyone, was still trying to fight back against the invisible enemy. The plague doctor costume, that nightmare outfit that makes modern hazmat suits look comfortable, has become one of history's most recognizable symbols. It appears in art, literature, video games, and Halloween stores. We've transformed these desperate medical professionals into something between monsters and heroes, Gothic icons of a time when death walked openly through European streets. But the real plague doctors were neither monsters nor heroes. They were just people, flawed, frightened, often drunk people, trying to survive in impossible circumstances with impossible tools. Consider what they actually faced. Not the romanticized version we see in movies, but the reality. Walking into rooms where entire families lay dying, where the smell alone could make you vomit, where every breath might carry your death. Examining bodies covered in suppurating wounds with nothing but a stick and prayers. Making decisions about who would be quarantined, who would be treated, who would be left to die, knowing that you were probably wrong, but having to decide anyway. Living in complete isolation, unable to touch another human being without potentially killing them or yourself. It was a kind of psychological torture that we can barely imagine. The medical theories they operated under seem laughable now. Miasma theory, the four humors, astrological medicine. We mock their bloodletting and mercury treatments, their toad amulets and vinegar baths. But they were working with the best knowledge available at the time, which happened to be completely wrong. They didn't have germ theory, microscopes, or any understanding of bacterial infection. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't really fight. It was like performing surgery in the dark with a butter knife while wearing oven mitts. Yet from this medical disaster came some genuine innovations. The idea of quarantine, those 40 days of isolation that gave us the word itself, emerged from plague doctor recommendations. The systematic recording of deaths and infections, what we would now call epidemiological data, was pioneered by plague doctors maintaining their grim tallies. The concept of protective medical equipment, however flawed the execution, started with those leather suits and beaked masks. Even the idea of public health as a government responsibility rather than individual problem emerged from cities hiring plague doctors to treat all citizens regardless of ability to pay. The social dynamics around plague doctors prefigured many modern medical ethics debates. The balance between public health and individual freedom, the right to refuse treatment, the obligation to treat dangerous patients, the distribution of limited medical resources during crisis. These weren't abstract philosophical questions for plague doctors. They were daily decisions with immediate, often fatal consequences. When you only have enough medicine for half your patients, who gets it? When quarantine means certain death for families locked in infected houses, do you enforce it anyway? These are questions we still struggle with today, and plague doctors were dealing with them while dressed as nightmare birds. The corruption and profiteering seem unconscionable until you consider the context. These were people who had accepted positions that were essentially death sentences with benefits. The mortality rate for plague doctors was astronomical. Many didn't survive their first month. Those who did lived in complete isolation, unable to participate in any normal human activities. Is it surprising that they demanded huge salaries, took bribes, and profited from their position? They were being asked to do the impossible while facing probable death. The fact that any of them maintained any ethical standards at all is more surprising than the corruption. The psychological toll was something we're only now beginning to understand. These were clearly people suffering from severe PTSD, depression, anxiety, and probably numerous other mental health conditions that didn't have names yet. They self-medicated with alcohol and opium, developed elaborate magical thinking rituals, and frequently went insane. The isolation alone would drive most people mad, and that was just the beginning of their problems. They lived in a constant state of fear, surrounded by death, unable to form normal human connections. It's amazing any of them remained functional at all. What's perhaps most fascinating is how the plague doctor has evolved in our cultural imagination. From terrifying medical professional to Gothic icon to steampunk fashion statement, the beaked mask that once inspired terror now appears on t-shirts and coffee mugs. We've transformed a symbol of death and desperation into something almost cute, a Halloween costume for people who want to look historically edgy. It's a strange kind of immortality for people who live such isolated, miserable lives. But maybe that transformation makes sense. The plague doctor represents humanity at its most desperate and most determined. They're symbols of what happens when civilization breaks down, but refuses to admit it's broken. They're reminders that someone has to do the impossible jobs, the dangerous jobs, the jobs that nobody should have to do. They're proof that even in the worst circumstances, surrounded by death and ignorance, humans will put on ridiculous costumes and pretend they know what they're doing, because the alternative is admitting defeat. In our modern world of advanced medicine and global health systems, it's easy to look back at plague doctors with a mixture of horror and amusement. How could they believe that bad smells caused disease? How could they think bloodletting would help? How could they walk around dressed like demon birds and think they were helping? But we should remember that they were doing their best with the tools and knowledge available. They were fighting an enemy they didn't understand with weapons that didn't work, and they kept fighting anyway. Today's medical professionals, with all their advanced training and sophisticated equipment, are descendants of those leather-clad plague doctors. The willingness to face disease, to enter contaminated spaces, to treat the infectious and dying, that courage comes from the same place. The only difference is that modern doctors actually know what they're doing. Usually. Most of the time. We hope. The plague doctor's story is ultimately a human story. It's about fear and courage, ignorance and determination, corruption and sacrifice. It's about people facing impossible situations with inadequate tools and doing it anyway. It's about maintaining the illusion of civilization even as it collapses around you. It's about walking into rooms full of death wearing a bird mask and pretending that makes sense, because what else are you going to do? So the next time you see that iconic beaked mask, whether in a museum or a Halloween store, remember what it really represents. Not just medieval medical ignorance or Gothic aesthetic, but humanity's stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would be the rational response. Remember the people who put on those masks, who walked into plague houses with their white sticks and their herb-stuffed beaks, who tried to fight death with vinegar and prayer and sheer bloody-minded determination. They failed mostly. Their treatments didn't work. Their theories were wrong. Their costumes were more likely to frighten patients to death than protect anyone from disease. But they tried. In circumstances that would break most of us. In conditions that we can barely imagine. Facing an enemy they couldn't understand, they put on their leather suits and their beaked masks, and they tried. That has to count for something. The plague doctors are gone now, relegated to history books and horror movies. The plague itself, while still existing, is treatable with modern antibiotics. We understand bacteria and viruses, transmission vectors, and immune responses. We have actual protective equipment that actually protects. We have treatments that actually treat. We've solved most of the problems that plague doctors faced with everything except the fundamental one. Someone still has to be willing to face the disease. In that sense, the spirit of the plague doctor lives on in every medical professional who enters an isolation ward, who treats infectious patients, who faces potential contamination to help others. The costume has evolved from leather and beaks to masks and gowns, but the courage required remains the same. The willingness to walk toward danger when everyone else is running away, that hasn't changed. The plague doctor's legacy is complicated. They were simultaneously heroes and villains, healers and harmers, professionals and charlatans. They represented both the best and worst of human nature, the courage to face impossible odds and the willingness to profit from others' misery. They were living contradictions wrapped in leather and breathing through herbs, walking symbols of humanity's simultaneous strength and weakness. In the end, perhaps that's why the plague doctor has become such an enduring symbol, not because they were successful or admirable or even particularly competent, but because they perfectly captured the human condition during crisis, terrified but trying, ignorant but acting, isolated but essential. They were us at our most desperate and our most determined, dressed in the most ridiculous costume ever designed for medical purposes. The story of plague doctors is a reminder that medical progress isn't just about scientific advancement. It's about the willingness of individuals to face the unknown, to risk themselves for others, to maintain hope even when hope seems irrational. Every modern medical breakthrough stands on the shoulders of people who were spectacularly wrong but kept trying anyway. The plague doctors, with their beaked masks and their bloodletting knives, their mercury treatments and their astronomical medical theories, were part of that long, painful, necessary journey from ignorance to understanding. So here's to the plague doctors. Those leather-wrapped, herb-breathing, stick-wielding figures who walked through hell in bird costumes. They weren't heroes. They weren't even particularly good at their jobs. but they showed up when showing up meant probable death. They maintained the fiction of medical authority when medicine had no authority. They counted the dead and comforted the dying and tried to maintain some semblance of civilization in cities that had become open-air morgues. They failed, mostly. But they failed with style, walking through the apocalypse dressed as nightmare birds, poking corpses with sticks, charging astronomical fees for treatments that didn't work, and somehow becoming one of history's most recognizable symbols in the process. It's a weird kind of immortality, but then again, everything about plague doctors was weird, and perhaps that's the most human thing about them. Faced with incomprehensible horror, they responded with incomprehensible solutions. Faced with death, they dressed as birds. Faced with disease, they prescribed poison. Faced with isolation, they became icons. They were humanity, at its most desperate and creative, its most terrible and fascinating. They were proof that even in the darkest times, humans will put on ridiculous costumes and pretend they know what they're doing. Because sometimes, that's all you can do. Sometimes the only response to an impossible situation is an impossible solution. Sometimes you have to put on the bird mask and pick up the stick and walk into the plague house, not because you know it will help, but because someone has to try. Someone has to maintain the illusion that civilization continues, that medicine matters, that humanity hasn't given up. The plague doctors did that. For all their failures and frauds, their corruption and incompetence, they did that. They walked into rooms full of death and tried to help, even when helping was impossible. They maintained the structure of medical authority, even when medicine had no answers. They were the thin leather line between civilization and complete collapse. And maybe, in the end, that's enough. Maybe showing up is heroic when showing up means probable death. Maybe trying is noble when trying is obviously futile. Maybe maintaining hope is valuable, even when hope is irrational. The plague doctors proved that humanity's greatest strength might not be our intelligence or our technology, but our sheer stubborn refusal to give up, even when giving up would be the smart choice. They're gone now. Those beaked physicians of the plague years. Their treatments have been replaced by antibiotics. Their theories have been replaced by actual science. Their costumes have been replaced by proper protective equipment. But their spirit, that particular mixture of courage and desperation, determination and delusion, that lives on in everyone who faces the impossible and tries anyway. The plague doctor's story isn't really about medicine. It's about humanity. It's about what we do when everything falls apart, when knowledge fails, when death surrounds us. We put on ridiculous costumes. We make up elaborate theories. We charge excessive fees. We pretend we know what we're doing. And somehow, through all that absurdity and failure, we survive. We continue. We eventually figure things out. That's the real lesson of the plague doctors. Not that medical ignorance is dangerous, though it is. Not that corruption thrives in crisis, though it does. But that humanity will always find a way to continue, even if that way involves dressing as a bird and poking corpses with sticks. We're ridiculous creatures, capable of spectacular failure and spectacular determination in equal measure. The plague doctors were proof of both. And so ends our journey through one of history's strangest chapters. The time when medicine meant mercury, protection meant leather, and doctors dressed as birds to fight an enemy they couldn't see or understand. It was humanity at its most desperate and its most creative, its most corrupt and its most courageous. It was the worst of times, and somehow humans found a way to make it even weirder. The plague doctors are gone, but their beaked shadows remain, reminding us that sometimes the most human response to inhuman circumstances is to put on an inhuman mask and keep trying anyway. They were us at our strangest and our strongest, our most foolish and our most determined. They were proof that even in the face of apocalyptic disease, humans will find a way to make things weird. And maybe that's what saved us. Not the treatments that didn't work, or the theories that were wrong, but the sheer human determination to keep trying, keep fighting, keep walking into plague houses dressed as nightmare birds because giving up simply wasn't an option. The plague doctors didn't cure the plague, but they proved that humanity could survive it, leather beaks and all. That's their legacy. Not medical advancement or scientific breakthrough, but the simple, stubborn, ridiculous human refusal to surrender, even when surrender would have been the rational choice. They showed us that sometimes courage looks like a leather bird mask. Sometimes heroism carries a white stick. Sometimes the most human thing you can do is put on an inhuman costume and pretend you're helping. The plague is mostly gone now, treatable when it appears. The doctors no longer need bird masks or leather suits. Medicine actually works most of the time. But somewhere in every medical professional who puts on protective equipment and enters a contaminated space, somewhere in everyone who faces the impossible with inadequate tools, somewhere in all of us, when we confront our fears with nothing but determination and probably incorrect theories, the spirit of the plague doctor lives on, beaked, leather-wrapped, probably drunk, definitely traumatized, but still showing up, still trying, still refusing to let death win without a fight, even if that fight involves dressed as a bird and poking things with sticks. That's humanity for you, weird until the very end, and somehow still here.